All right, take a deep breath, because what just happened on the battlefield is not small, it is not minor, and it is definitely not temporary. The Russian military's loss of access to Starlink has turned out to be much worse than most people expected, and that is saying something, because even before this, analysts already believed it would hurt badly. But now, it looks crippling. Let me explain this in simple terms. Starlink was not just a tool for Russia. It was the backbone of communication across large parts of their frontline operations. It allowed units to coordinate. It allowed commanders to react quickly. It allowed them to exploit small weaknesses in Ukrainian defenses. Now that access is gone. And when communication collapses in modern warfare, everything else starts to collapse with it. One of the first visible effects has already appeared. There has been an immediate reduction in Russian assaults along parts of the front line. Why? Because if your soldiers cannot communicate with nearby units, launching a frontal assault becomes extremely dangerous. Imagine trying to drive through a busy city at night with no headlights and no GPS, while the other drivers can see perfectly. That is the situation. Ukraine still has strong protected communication networks. Russia, in many areas, does not. That imbalance changes everything. Some Russian soldiers have reportedly tried raising money to buy traditional radios. But radios are easier to intercept, easier to jam, easier to track. There is a reason modern militaries moved beyond that. So at this point, parts of the Russian military are effectively fighting blind. And in a war defined by real-time information, fighting blind is catastrophic. Now, many people assumed this would be temporary. They believed Russia would adapt. After all, throughout this war, Russia has eventually adjusted to new challenges. When drone warfare became dominant, they adapted. When electronic warfare disrupted drones, they experimented with fiber optic systems. So the assumption was simple, they'll figure this out too. But this time is different. This is not just about building a new piece of technology. Even if Russia could create something similar to Starlink, you need massive infrastructure, you need a dense satellite network, you need years of deployment, you need integration at scale. That is not something you fix in a few months. And here is where things get even more interesting. Russia's behavior suggests that they know they do not have a quick solution, because instead of unveiling an alternative, they are doing something desperate. Russia is now advertising to Ukrainian citizens, asking them to place their personal Starlink systems onto the approved whitelist, so Russian forces can use them. Think about that carefully. A military power is asking civilians inside enemy territory to help restore its communications. That alone tells you how serious the problem is. Now let's quickly break down how this whitelist system works in simple terms. Starlink access in Ukrainian territory operates through authorization. Specific terminals are approved. If a unit or a device is not on that approved list, it simply does not function for military operations. So even if Russia physically possesses terminals, without authorization, they are useless. It's like having a smartphone without service. The device exists, but it cannot connect. So what is Russia doing? They are essentially asking Ukrainian citizens to risk their lives, leave a digital trail, and assist Russian military communications. This is not a small ask. This is asking someone to commit an act that could easily be tracked and prosecuted. Which raises a serious question. If Russia believed it could fix this problem internally, why would it take that risk? The answer is uncomfortable because they likely do not believe they can solve it quickly. In warfare, there are always small groups of citizens inside any country who oppose their own government. That is true in Ukraine, that is true in Russia. Throughout the war, Russia has tried to use such individuals for strategic purposes, sabotage, intelligence, disruption. But those individuals are a limited resource. And normally, if you have a limited resource inside enemy territory, you protect it carefully. You use it strategically. You avoid exposing it. Now, Russia appears willing to burn through that resource just to restore communication. That is not a sign of confidence. That is a sign of urgency. And this creates a dilemma. If Russia pressures these individuals to assist with Starlink access, many of them will be exposed. That means Ukraine gains an opportunity to identify and remove internal threats. So even if Russia gains short-term communication benefits, it risks long-term strategic damage. That trade-off alone tells you how severe this communication breakdown really is. Now let's zoom out and look at the battlefield itself. This war, more than almost any in history, is a war of communication. Both sides rely on near real-time intelligence, drone feeds, rapid troop coordination, instant reporting of enemy movement. That constant information flow has kept front lines relatively static because whenever one side tries to break through, the other side sees it quickly and responds. Communication equals defense. Communication equals offense. Communication equals survival. Russia's strategy in many areas has depended on creating small gaps through heavy attrition, then rapidly moving forces into those gaps before Ukraine can respond. But that strategy only works if you can coordinate at scale. If you cannot relay information quickly, those gaps close before you exploit them. If you cannot coordinate reinforcements, opportunities vanish. And now with communication weakened, Russia's forces are operating more like disconnected pockets instead of a cohesive machine. Picture an orchestra. If the conductor disappears and the musicians cannot hear each other, the performance collapses into noise. That is what happens to a military without communication dominance. Individual units struggle to call for backup, and they struggle to report supply shortages. They struggle to relay enemy positions. Even simple coordination becomes delayed, and in modern warfare, delay equals failure. That is why this issue is not minor. That is why it may actually be a game changer. Now, that does not mean the war ends tomorrow. It does not mean instant collapse, but it opens a window where Ukraine can increase attrition, a window where Russian offensives become less efficient, a window where momentum shifts, not dramatically overnight, but steadily. And wars are often decided not by one explosive moment, but by steady imbalances that grow over time. Some analysts are cautious about calling this decisive, and that caution is understandable. Wars are unpredictable. Both sides adapt. But here's the key point. When you see a military power willing to undermine its own long-term assets just to patch a communication gap, you know the problem is real, not theoretical, not exaggerated, but real. And that is the clearest signal we have. Russia is not acting like a force that has a backup plan ready. It is acting like a force under pressure. Pressure on the front lines, pressure in coordination, pressure in maintaining offensive capability. And in a war defined by speed of information, losing that speed is devastating. If one side can see clearly and the other side is partially blind, the balance shifts gradually, relentlessly. And that is why this Starlink issue is not just about satellites. It is about control. Control of communication, control of coordination, control of the battlefield itself. And when control begins to slip, even slightly, it can trigger a chain reaction. So the real question is not whether this matters. It clearly does. The real question is, how long can Russia operate effectively without restoring that communication dominance? And how much ground strategically, operationally, psychologically could be lost in the meantime? Because in modern warfare, information is not just support. Information is power. And right now that power is uneven.